Chapter 4 Erik Who? I had never heard of Erik Menendez or the sensation surrounding his case. I had no interest in courtroom trials, but something made me stop in my tracks that day as I walked past the television set and the image of a burgundy wooden courtroom. Things happen for a reason in life, and as far as I knew, my reasoning was simple: curiosity. I could never have imagined that single act would one day lead to a complete transformation of my way of life. Erik's face made me pause. I know him, I thought. I didn't, but I felt like I knew him from somewhere. It was more of a feeling of familiarity than actual remembrance, so I watched the trial proceedings a little more. The circumstances of the case were intriguing. Two brothers, handsome, educated, and athletic, accused of killing their very wealthy parents in their Beverly Hills mansion. Hollywood doesn't make movies with this sort of plot because no one would believe it. More amazing, the case didn't revolve around guilt or innocence, but motive. The brothers had confessed. The question for the two separate juries was why, not who. Now I was interested. Aside from my inexplicable sense of sympathy for Erik, or maybe because of it, I became increasingly curious. The more time that passed, the more I wanted to know about the case. I knew the brothers didn't do it for the money. They would have inherited a fortune. In fact, the grand jury refused to indict the brothers under the theory of financial gain. Not surprisingly, the prosecutors weren't pressing that theory. After all, they could never connect the dots when it came to a financial motive. In fact, most of the so-called pieces of evidence didn't add up. Aside from proving that the killings actually occurred, the prosecution's explanation of motive seemed scattered. I pictured a couple of detectives sitting at their plain coffee table in the middle of one of the most affluent communities in the country, surmising the same motive they had assigned to every Beverly Hills crime over the past 50 years. It's simple. They did it for the money. Of course, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't for the money. And with each new state witness, the prosecutor's theories became more strained and confusing. Although Lyle and Erik Menendez had admitted to the killings, it was clear that the prosecution didn't have a clue as to why they did it. For anyone who was following the trial, the case was more fascinating than an actual whodunit. But for Erik, it was just more of the torture he had faced his entire life. The case wasn't just brutal for the participants, it was also brutal to watch. As the details of the brothers' lives emerged on the witness stand, from relative after relative, one truth was inescapable. Their childhood, shrouded in immense power and growing family wealth, was marred by violence, terror, and a dark secret that relatives and friends would only hint at before a reliable barrage of objections obscured the testimony. In my own home at the time, life continued at its supersonic pace. Chuck was in and out of the house, like rolling dervish in those years. He had houses to build, to buy, to sell, rental properties, a convenience store, and a liquor store to manage. He had little time for courtroom dramas. Fortunately, he had me to fill him in at night on the day's proceedings. Lucky guy. Small battles would flare over control of the remote to the television and the courtroom recaps. My persistence, however, fed his eventual interest. The prosecution's case was meant to be basic. Their goal was to prove the elements of the crime. A killing had occurred. The brothers were responsible. The brothers should be made to face the ultimate penalty, death. Of course, it didn't help their case that the brothers had brought shame to the Los Angeles criminal justice system. From day one, the investigators had missed all of the clues pointing to lie on Erik. Without Erik's confession to his psychotherapist, there never would have been a case. Add to this the fact that O.J. Simpson had been acquitted and set free just 6 days before the start of the brothers' second trial. And you get a sense of pressure facing the police, the district attorney, and even the judge. Los Angeles didn't need another black eye. It was obvious how bad the prosecutor wanted a conviction. But it was also appalling in a way, to think the jury would put trust in the Los Angeles police force to unearth the motive for a crime they couldn't solve in the first place. It was true that Erik had confessed to a psychotherapist because of an overwhelming sense of guilt and an increasing desire to take his own life. He couldn't live with what had happened. It was also true that the therapist had quickly turned Erik's confession into a profit, making scheme by blackmailing the brothers. But the police and district attorney never seemed interested in the actual reason for the crime. They were selling a product, retribution. Everything else was just window dressing. The chain of events leading to the confession, of course, were fairly simple. I was a Midwesterner, and to me, it was the kind of story I would almost expect to take place in Los Angeles or Beverly Hills. The psychotherapist treating Erik for depression following the killings learned from Erik that the brothers were responsible. The therapist had a doctor-patient privilege to uphold, but in true Hollywood style, he saw a money-making opportunity. He would blackmail the brothers by threatening to talk to the police if they didn't pay him to protect their secret. And there was another Hollywood twist. The psychotherapist was having a sexual relationship with a female patient. In the course of that relationship, he had privately relayed all of the brothers' secrets to his lover. When she later went to the police and accused the therapist of raping her and then trying to brainwash her, the story came out. The woman cooperated with the police to record the psychotherapist's telephone conversations, and once caught, the therapist exchanged his testimony against the brothers in the return for the DA's agreement, not to prosecute him for his multiple criminal acts. Caught in his own web of lies, the therapist turned state's evidence against the brothers. He was later barred from ever practicing therapy again. So many aspects of the case had unusual, almost bizarre twists. The first prosecution witness cracked open Pandora's box by revealing Mr. Menendez to be a dominating and aggressive man, who frightened not only his sons, but many of the people who came in contact with him. Another prosecution witness, who had been a close friend of Lyle Menendez, denied knowing about any dark secrets in the Menendez household. Cross-examination by the defense was explosive. The witness had, years before, given a tape-recorded interview to a journalist during which he elaborately recalled an emotional conversation he had with Lyle 4 months before the killings. Lyle had revealed to him that he had been molested for years by his father. The coroner testified that a killing took place and presented weeks of testimony about the gory photographs from the crime scene. A score of investigators testified about why they suspected Erik and Lyle, their eventual arrest. Through it all, the state did not present testimony about motive. They did present evidence that Erik had purchased a Jeep and placed the tennis coach his parents had originally hired under a full-time contract. Lyle, on the other hand, had spent lavishly, and the prosecutors painstakingly detailed his expenditures. The media made much of this. The coverage was highly sensational. But the prosecutors still appeared reluctant to press the financial gain theory. The pieces didn't seem to fit, and besides, the family had also spent lavishly before the killings. The defense argued that the seemingly perfect home was anything but. They said that behind the facade was a household of terror. This truth, they asserted, was witnessed by many who stayed in or visited the house. The killings, the defense insisted, may have been a crime and certainly a tragedy, but they were not murders. Murder is cold-blooded and premeditated, but there was no malice in the hearts of the defendants. Fear and panic, but not malice. And the circumstances and evidence of that night pointed away from premeditation, not towards it. As the case unfolded, the principal question still remained: what makes children kill their parents? What possible motive can exist for such a heinous crime? Mothers and fathers are viewed as symbols of love, protecting, and nurturing. Can those symbols be erased by a lifetime of psychological, physical, and sexual torture? And what happens when those symbols become so corrupted that they are simply replaced by distrust and fear? Erik and Lyle found themselves confronted on that fateful night. The defense argued with a circumstance in which there was no way out. Severe violence or death was about to occur one way or the other. In a state of panic and fear, they reacted and lashed out. Panic may not be tantamount or justification, the defense asserted, but neither was it murder. Prison as punishment up to 15 years may be warranted, but not the punishment that carries a sentence of life in prison. The difficulty for the defense was in convincing people that children would never believe their own parents could be capable of seriously harming or killing them. The defense position was that any child who had been psychologically tortured, beaten, or molested could not help but believe that their attacker could commit murder, especially when their own death had been graphically described for them. Jose Menendez, the defense argued, believed in persuasion through fear. Dozens of relatives testified and provided a portrait of each member of the family. Kitty Menendez was a strong-boned, pretty woman from fierce Irish and Scandinavian stock. Mary Louise Anderson by birth, she was proud, intelligent, and remarkably strong-willed. Little stood in her way. She did not easily tolerate excuses and demanded the best effort of herself and others. Image and excellence was everything. It is what she expected of herself and her children. She showed her strength and hid her weaknesses. She punished herself fiercely, violently, and enforced the same with her children. About her children, you might hear her say, "Boys will become men, and real men are raised hard." She instilled fear in her children early on. Her love may not have been conditional, but one of the ways she punished was by restricting her love. Love had to be earned. She loved her pets, especially her ferret. She raised them with care, but she meted out punishment to child and animal alike. When Erik was bad, he slept in the closet. When the ferret was bad, she kept him in the same closet. She was genuinely devoted to her animals. She was heartbroken when they died. One ferret she loved so much that when it died, she had its body stuffed and placed it on top of the television in the family room. She was outgoing and aggressive. She was blistering in her defense of her family's honor. She swung from jubilation to rage to agonizing bouts of depression. She was an impenetrable wall of image and isolation. Very few would ever see her weaknesses, her pain, but the few who knew of it testified to a grief that tore through her and sunk unrelenting claws into her heart. Her choice of escape was alcohol and prescription drugs. As with everything in her life, she used her drugs to excess. Although she loved her brothers, her mother and her sister, she hid secrets that tormented her. Secrets about her children, secrets about her past. Some of the secrets in her family she labeled as sick. And all of them were too much for one woman to bear. There would be fighting downstairs and in the bedrooms, screams, slaps, plates, and household objects thrown, shattered. In the morning, blood would stain the sheets, bruises seen but not explained. Secrets spawned within secrets in a family that all times blistered with violence and fear. 3 times, Kitty Menendez tried to end her life. This little-known fact helped to explain the torment of her household. With a woman so unaccustomed to failure, the obvious question was why would she give up? Nonetheless, Kitty Menendez, fierce and irrepressible, had met her match. In time, she began documenting her death wish. She described in detailed letters how she would place the nozzle of a gun to her mouth. A young Erik found one of these letters. He fell in a heap to the floor, crying. Erik and Lyle tried to intervene with their mother. They pleaded with her to leave their father. They attempted to talk with her about the things she wouldn't publicly admit. Things she wouldn't even admit to them. Things they knew were true. But she would not leave her husband. She hated him and she loved him all at the same time. But she would never leave him. Instead, she increasingly drank and self-medicated, and her habit gained alarming momentum. She hid behind a facade of accumulating wealth. In Beverly Hills, her secrets were comparably small and easy to cover. Her life was becoming tragic. One day, she exited a sporting goods store with Erik. She placed a long box from the store in the trunk of her Mercedes. She opened it for Erik to see. It was a long-barreled rifle. "What's that for?" he asked. She looked at him and simply said, "I'm gonna kill someone." Then she closed the trunk and got inside the car. Perhaps even more shocking was Erik's reaction. He simply nodded and wondered as they drove away who she was going to kill. The notion that she could kill was something he never doubted. Erik's father was Cuban-born, brilliant, and physically dominant. Big-muscled, big-boned, and with the will of a tiger, Jose Enrique Menendez was a powerful presence in any crowd. He was the kind of man who could silence another with a look and make them tremble with a stare. He had dark, liquid eyes, beneath fine brown hair, and hard Spanish features. His true lineage was Castilian. He was witty and could be generous. He was anything but petty, but he was not a man who forgave easily. As his brother-in-laws testified, he was a wonderful friend, but you never wanted to cross him, ever. Misfortune struck those who crossed him. Some died. Jose Menendez was not a talker. He backed up everything he said. He was an extraordinary athlete. He had broken an Olympic swimming record during an Olympic qualifier, but he never got to compete in the games because Castro rose to power in 1960. Jose arrived in America at the age 16, penniless. His family's entire wealth remained locked in Cuba. Relative after relative testified that he was a virtual force of nature. fearless, indomitable. He molded a future with a will that could not be denied. He was the life of the party, and with the blink of an eye, he could chill you to the bone. His philosophy was to have greatness by any means necessary. Within 30 years, he had created a small growing empire and lived in a $4 million mansion under the matriarch of the family. His mother, he was the leader of his clan. He was the golden child. Diane Vandermolen, a cousin of the Menendez, lived in their house for nearly a year. She testified that she idolized her aunt Kitty Menendez, and yet she was also terrified of her. Kitty trained her never to reveal household secrets. She was obsessed with image. Diane testified that the fear of doing anything wrong in the house created an atmosphere that was so oppressive and traumatic that within 6 months she had visions of suicide and wrote poems about dying. Anxiety, tension, and fear hung in layers in the house. One of Diane's sisters, Kathy, testified that she stayed in the home for 3 months as a teenager. She was so frightened and filled with dread during this time that she had to end her stay early. She testified that more than a dozen years later, she was still in therapy because of those months and her ensuing nightmares. Diane testified that when Lyle was a boy, he came to her and told her that his father had repeatedly molested him. She said that when Mr. Menendez was alone with either son in their bedroom, she was not allowed down the hallway that led to their room. Other relatives would also testify about the restriction on the hallway. Andy Cano, another cousin and close childhood friend of Eric's, recounted a conversation while the two were still very young, in which Erik told him that strange sexual things were occurring with his father. He asked Andy if he thought it was normal for dads to have sexual interactions with their sons. Andy told Erik that he didn't think that was normal. Relative after relative described the family who was on the surface perfect, but each recounted something terrifying and sometimes tragic stories of physical and psychological abuse that belied that image. A weird relationship existed in the family between small punishments and minute wrongdoings. This led to an environment that attorneys claimed of uncertainty and anxiety. Peter Cano, an uncle, described an incident he said he would never forget. Lyle was 5 years old. He had been running around the house while Peter and Jose were having a conversation. Jose became annoyed with Lyle's behavior and ordered Lyle to stop. When Lyle didn't stop, Jose became furious. He made a single hand gesture, and Lyle froze. Then Jose walked to his son and whispered something into his ear. Lyle soiled himself immediately. Whatever he had said had obviously terrified Lyle and made him incontent. This reaction, of course, was not enough for Jose. His son's fear had embarrassed him. At this, Jose dragged Lyle down the hall to a back room. Fearing for Lyle, Peter walked to the back room and opened the door to see Jose punch Lyle. Peter scolded him for punching a 5-year-old. Jose told him that in his house he does as he chooses. Peter immediately packed up his family and left. The silent implication was that if Mr. Menendez would do this to a 5-year-old, how would he treat an 8, 10, or 12-year-old? And where was Miss Menendez? What could make a boy lose control of his bowels from only a whisper in his ear? Lyle testified first, then Erik. Their testimony laid bare a house of danger. What was on the outside, a perfect family, was on the inside, a home built on fear. Whippings and private bedroom massages that escalated into sickening degrees of sexual violations provided a background for how two sons could ever believe their parents would act out violently against them. Erik began to have night terrors and episodes of sleepwalking and screaming. In the middle of the night, his mother, unable to wake him, would carry him to the bathtub and douse his head under cold water. The night terrors occurred for months at a time. Their cause was not diagnosed. Erik tried to run away when he was 12. His father found him, slammed him against a tree, and described to him what would happen if he ever tried to run away again. The image of his own death were graphically imprinted in his brain. Lyle tried to protect Erik when he could, but when he did, he suffered badly for it. The boys were kept isolated in their childhood and had no one else to turn to but each other. A new term was popularized by a famed and critical defense attorney around the Menendez trial: abuse excuse. The man wrote a book about it. The term implied that Erik and Lyle Menendez were citing quote-unquote abuse as a justification for homicide. Ignorance is contagious. Others picked up on the term. The book even sold well. The argument is nonsensical. Take, for example, a woman who has been raped. Sometime later, be it a minute or a month, she retrieves a gun and kills her rapist. According to the abuse excuse, her rape is incidental and unrelated to the killing she has committed. It is an excuse that should not be considered, goes the argument. Such craziness swirled around the case, as if it had wings of its own. The term abuse itself is a silly one. The definition needs to be changed. Emotional torture is not abuse. Molestation is not abuse. Physical torture is not abuse. All of these are violent acts. Perhaps the man should have published his book under rape excuse or torture excuse, but then he would have just looked ridiculous. While I never condoned killing of any kind and believed Erik should have been convicted of manslaughter, a lesser degree of murder, I found that I had made up my mind about the case, even before Erik took the stand. It wasn't unusual to find me yelling at my television during the emotional trial. Futile, but not unusual. The case affected people in that way. It challenged their most basic beliefs of rights and wrongs. In the end, in those last few days before the killings, Erik revealed to his brother Lyle that the abuse had not ended, and that he wanted to die. It was a Wednesday, 5 days before the tragic killings of August 20th, 1989. Lyle, 3 years older, had always been Erik's protector. He blamed himself for not having shielded Erik. Their mother, in a strange, probably drunken state, confronted them and in an argument with Lyle, admitted to knowing about the abuse. She screamed that everything that was wrong in her life stemmed from the birth of her sons. It's unlikely she truly believed this, but words can be persuasive. On Thursday, Lyle confronted his father. He told his father that the sick events had to end, or he would tell the world. Jose knew his problem was growing, and after the confrontation, Lyle realized that his father couldn't live with a constant risk of exposure. Erik and Lyle had passed a point of no return, a place where they didn't want to be. When others had passed that point and opposed Jose Menendez, it frequently led to their downfall. The brothers believed their lives were in danger. Perhaps they were right, or perhaps a lifetime of fear only made it seem that way. The secrets were now exposed to the family at large. Lyle wanted to run away. Erik was desolate and refused to run. There were a dozen disputed and undisputed facts about what occurred on Friday, Saturday, and even in the hours leading up to that Sunday night, the details of which the prosecutors and defense attorneys argued to bolster their positions. Were Lyle and Erik terrified or not? As with almost every facet of the case, each piece of evidence was wrangled over the courtroom and by the media. The events of Sunday night were not in dispute. Around 10 o'clock in the evening in Beverly Hills, 10 to 12 shots shattered the night. Jose and Kitty Menendez lay dead. Lyle and Erik both testified that everything came to an explosive head that fateful night, when for seemingly no apparent reason, Mr. and Mrs. Menendez refused to let Erik out of the house. Erik was ordered to his room. Mr. Menendez said he would be up to the room in a minute. Mr. Menendez told Lyle that what was about to happen was all his fault. Erik had climbed the stairs after his father had ordered him to wait for him in his room. Mr. Menendez's orders were never defied. At the top of the stairs, he began to tremble and panic. After days of worry, he said all he could think of was that he could not wait in his room. The fear had nearly paralyzed him. Lyle said that everything they had most feared was happening now. The prosecutor argued that they should have left. Whatever rational thoughts a panicked mind is capable of entertaining may be arguable. At some point, I believe instinct and root preservation impulses kick in. What is not arguable is that second later, it was all over. Their first reaction was not to run away. A dozen blasts in the center of Beverly Hills on an otherwise quiet night is certain to produce an immediate response. With armed, roving private security and a police patrol, with a police station less than a mile away, the response time should be measured in minutes. But nobody showed. Erik sat on the stairs, shaking and crying from the shock. Minutes passed, and nothing. When fired shotguns eject shells, not having taken precautions because they had not planned the killing, their fingerprints were all over the shells. Rather than wait around any longer, they decided to leave. The shells had to be retrieved. When more time passed with no police response, they left. Erik was a mess. He could not be seen in public. Of course, they had no alibi. In fact, it was worse than that. A friend named Perry testified that he told the police that Lyle and Erik failed to show up at their scheduled outing that night. All he could tell the police was that they weren't with him, so they must have been somewhere else. All Lyle and Erik could say was that they were at the movies, but naturally they couldn't produce ticket stubs. Ultimately, without an alibi and no way to create one, they threw the weapons over a mountainside and returned home. 2 months later, with an overwhelming desire to end his own life, unable to live with his actions, Erik sought out a psychotherapist. This eventually led to his arrest. At the first trial, in January 1994, Erik and Lyle had separate juries, both juries deadlocked. Out of the two juries, a total of 12 jurors voted for manslaughter, a lesser conviction than murder, carrying up to 15 years in prison. 4 jurors voted for second-degree murder, and 8 jurors voted for first degree. A second trial was held a year and a half later. It began 6 days after O.J. Simpson was acquitted. Their trial judge, the same judge who presided over the trial of the 4 LAPD officers who were acquitted of beating Rodney King, an outcome that sparked the LA riots, was suddenly under tremendous pressure to see Erik and Lyle convicted of the murder. He reversed his own major ruling from the first trial. He disallowed over 75% of the defense witnesses. Unless a witness had actually seen a physical or sexual assault, they could not testify to any observations about the Menendez family. Even Peter Cano's testimony about the assault on Lyle was ruled as remote and irrelevant. The defense manslaughter instruction of imperfect self-defense. For a person who honestly but unreasonably believes they will be assaulted or killed was not allowed in the second trial. The defense was led to believe until the end of the trial that these instructions would be given. The judge also forced Erik to testify before any other witnesses. Systematically, the entire defense case was dismantled. The judge, having presided over the first trial, knew exactly how to get a conviction. It was of little surprise, given the rulings in the second trial, that Erik and Lyle were convicted of premeditated murder in March 1996 and sentenced to life in prison. During the middle of Erik's trial, there was a point when I saw him looking discouraged. I couldn't imagine what he was going through emotionally, but I wanted to let him know that there were people out there who empathized with the very awful ordeal he was experiencing. Yes, he and Lyle had done something terrible, and they would certainly be punished for it. But even casual observers of the trial understood the depths of the trouble and abuse in the Menendez home. No casual observer myself, I was absolutely overwrought by what I learned, so I wrote Erik a brief letter. Chuck believed that he might actually write back. I didn't. Erik was in the middle of trial, and I'd heard that thousands of people were writing to show support. Where would he find the time, much less the stamps? Still, I thought it was helpful that he was receiving letters. I wrote a couple of paragraphs on a plain sheet of paper, and I had no intentions of writing again. It was kind of a whim anyways. A month passed, then a letter arrived in my mailbox. I was shocked. Chuck had that "I told you so" look. Erik's letter was brief. He wrote that he put my letter aside to write me back. Something about my letter had caught his eye, he wrote. He asked me to be patient with him in his response to my future letters, because his life was basically in chaos. Huh? So he wanted to begin a correspondence? Chuck didn't care, but this time he supported Erik's defense too. He probably felt it would be a nice distraction for me. It's not as though Chuck was spending a lot of time with his family, and if there was ever a safe distraction for his wife, it was a guy in jail several thousand miles away. Gradually, a correspondence developed with Erik. I found his letters surprisingly warm and funny. It's as though the falseness and life that preoccupied so many people had been ripped away from him, leaving him time to consider those things that mattered most. Why pretend? His letters seemed to say, "Life is raw, let's just be friends." As the years passed, I felt increasingly alone in my marriage. Chuck's success and wealth bloomed. I had every material thing I wanted. He made sure we had the perfect house, the perfect cars, the perfect manicured lawn, and the best designer clothes. Even my dogs looked high fashion. I was a professional dog show handler and traveled throughout the States and Canada for shows. I was a yuppie married with accessories, the handsome, ultra-successful real estate developer husband, and the attractive, proper wife for him to showcase. We attended the right private clubs, dinners, and parties. Chuck was Mr. Conventional and proper. I had a nasty habit of creating innocent mischief to wrinkle his precisely groomed feathers. Chuck was always so concerned with what everybody thought about him. If he was not getting along with one of his clients, he would stay awake at night, worrying. He would do whatever it took to please people. Chuck was a very nice guy. He was a rare breed because he actually cared about people. He waged a tremendous battle over self-image and a general lack of self-esteem, and it drove him to be both perfect and overly conventional in everything he did. I loved him. I had built my world around him, but he wasn't my knight in shining armor. He wasn't a romantic guy, and we never talked about spiritual matters. Even when I was in a room with Chuck, I'd at times fantasize about being with a man who thrived on romance and placed our marriage, or at least me, ahead of everything else. But through the years, I'd given up on those dreams. My fantasies weren't practical, I knew. Men just weren't like that. I had all the material comforts. I was being silly to want it all. I was also a realist. Chuck was a good man. Yes, I was emotionally neglected. Sure, I'd complain to him about it, but that did little good. Every so often, when my resentment reached the critical level, I'd punish him by sleeping on the sofa. The whole point of sleeping on the sofa is actually to initiate one big fishing expedition. The man is supposed to come to you and ask you what is wrong, beg, grovel a little, and carry you back to bed. Chuck viewed it differently. My sleeping on the sofa was his opportunity to have more bed space. So after a couple of hours of waiting in the dark, when it was abundantly clear I wouldn't be catching any fish, I'd walk back to our master bedroom, where predictably I'd find Chuck sound asleep. Naturally, I'd wake him up by hitting him over the head with my pillow. Nothing changed. For the most part, I just gave up. I had other ways to fill the emptiness in my life. I had a daughter who was my main priority and who was becoming a young adult right before my eyes. I also had love from all of my furry and feathery creatures. One in particularly touched my life in a way like no other. He was a little French bulldog. I named him Marky. As Marky grew older, I felt his love for people. I couldn't help but notice he loved to show in the ring. For a French bulldog, he was very typey and very sound. When Marky hit the show circuit, everybody loved him. He had an astounding pedigree. Marky's grandfather was renowned. Marky was born to please. He and I moved as one, like dancers in a ballet. One blue ribbon led to another. He finished his championship title very quickly. Traveling and being away from home was not a highlight in my life, but it was only for weekends. Marky, on the other hand, seemed to love it. He was always happy and energetic. I loved being around him. I had no way to know that my time with Marky would be short. I was going to a dog show in Minneapolis one particular weekend, and I left Marky with a friend of mine. I would pick him up the very next day. While away, late Friday, Marky grew ill. My friend called me and told me she was at the vet's office. They didn't know what was wrong with Marky. He was only 2 years old, with no symptoms of poor health. How could something be wrong? He was just with me. I was perplexed and suddenly scared. She said it seemed serious and nobody knew what was wrong with him. I just wanted to get to him, to comfort the poor little guy. On instinct that night, without thinking about what should or should not be possible, I closed my eyes and prayed, reached out to Marky. From 300 miles away, I felt this beautiful animal. Within moments, my joy became a terrible fear. I knew then, in a way I can't explain, that something was very wrong. The call came hours later to confirm what inside I already knew. The vet could do nothing. He didn't even know why Marky was ill. As a necropsy was determined, there was nothing physically wrong with him. It was as if slowly, one by one, the angels had loosened the threads that bound Marky's soul to his body. He died on a cold table, hundreds of miles away from me. If only I could have comforted him. I know he was scared. I still feel the guilt at not being by his side. After I buried Marky, I retired from showing dogs and walked away from the world forever. I fell into a minor depression. My gloom didn't sit well with Chuck. He decided the greater responsibilities would cheer me up. He bought another business, this time a huge health club in a 40,000 square foot facility. 4 indoor tennis courts, 4 indoor racquetball courts, 3 floors. It was a great investment. I enjoyed the challenge and poured myself into it. I explored every aspect of the business. Soon thereafter, in January 1995, I learned I was pregnant. I was leaping with joy. I was going to be a new mother again. My daughter Lisa was excited, and Chuck was in awe. Our little family was growing. I naively believed that my pregnancy would bring Chuck closer to me. Talia was born September 1st, 1995. My little Virgo, my miracle. Lisa had been a quiet, calm baby. Talia was an insatiable, sweet ball of energy. It was astonishing if she slept for more than 2 hours straight, and if she wasn't sleeping, she was giggling. Chuck would sing to her the Kenny Loggins song about Winnie the Pooh. It was sweet and beautiful, and I loved the family we were building. On snowy days that winter, you might as well have painted a Norman Rockwell portrait of us. Unfortunately, what should have been the happiest time in our lives wasn't. Chuck continued to grow distant from me. My heart ached for what I would never know again. I longed for the tender years, the times when Chuck had passion about us. I knew he loved me. During the rough periods, he would beg me never to leave him. It's true, at times I needed to hear the words and to see that side of him. I needed to know that deep down he needed me. I was a pretty wife, doting mother, respectable citizen, reluctant but heavily involved civic leader, and constant advocate for my impressive family. I played the role Chuck wanted me to play. I did so willingly, and after a while, it was the only role I knew. The illusion of it all seemed very real. I really believed that all the lovely adjectives we used to describe our life had substance, and that they insulated me from the sadness I would occasionally see on the faces of strangers. Tragedy awakens us, peels away the skin of the world, and allows us to see how fooled we had become by our own pretensions. The descriptions of my life were pomp and show, no more substantial than the cardboard facade of a western town in an old Hollywood movie. Sadly, I didn't recognize the facade. I believed in my story. I believed in it until the walls caved in on me, in one horrible moment that would lead to the long winter in my life.